This morning, our speaker is Danny Choriki. If you come to the Wednesday night's community lecture series, you are probably familiar with Danny already. He speaks frequently there on a whole variety of topics. We asked him, this program started when 3 of our members came and said they would like to hear more about atheism, and he was suggested as a speaker who could talk on this. And we ended up with a bit of a series because we were already in conversation with Phil Jensen, so he talked in September, and now we have a talk from Danny. He is a lifelong student of philosophy, a trained social scientist, a cultural critic with a keen awareness of the importance of understanding, and one of our very newest members at the Billings Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Thank you for being here, Danny.
Hi, how are you doing today? I began with this image for the following reason. I love it because what it shows is that to study people, you have to start peeling back behind the images. So what you're seeing there is a picture of the 1930 American Gothic painting, and in the foreground is the photograph are the actual models that were used in that. A dentist and the daughter of the painter. And I find it very interesting that the woman who did that consistently tried to tell people that she was a daughter. Just peeling back reality there. Now, as a good social scientist, you always begin any conversation, or a philosopher too, with your assumptions. My assumptions, I could go through them bit by bit, piece by piece, but it basically boils down to the fact that I was raised by liberal Catholics who themselves were raised as Buddhists, and the end result of that was a humanist long before I actually understood what humanism was or how any of that stuff came about or any of that stuff. We're going to go through a whole bunch of slides, and I apologize that I didn't. Normally, I don't put my outline in the slides. Normally, the slides are for impact. I didn't get there. I had probably 20 hours worth of information in my head on this thing, and getting it down to 25 minutes wasn't very easy to do. A couple of really quick key definitions, though. Definitions matter in science and philosophy and public policy. You have to start from the premise that everybody is talking about the same thing. That fails to happen so much these days. A key thing to remember about philosophy is that philosophy has always been about defining the good life and helping people to figure out how to get there. So because of that, philosophy mattered 3,000 years ago. It matters today. One of the saddest things I think about Western civilization is we've forgotten that. We have really, really lost that. And part of what we're going to be doing here today is starting to peel back some of the underlying assumptions that got us to where we are today. Literally how we ended up in this room, because Unitarianism actually played a pretty key role in all this stuff that happens. 2 other real quick distinctions. Morals are passed on culturally. They are taught from person to person. Ethics are derived. An ethic is when somebody says, okay, these are my assumptions, therefore these behaviors matter. What happens then is that when that is passed on to the next generation, unless the process is passed on, it becomes a moral, right? Because it was taught. It wasn't understood, it wasn't derived at. It's a key distinction. And it's one of the reasons why what's happening in the world today is happening the way it's happening. These are just some core values of humanism. I've brought along a handout. If anybody, it's basically the last humanist statement, the third humanist statement. Very, very simple, very to the point. You can come and grab a couple of them if you want afterwards. Okay, whoops, I forgot the 2 are not connected. I'm clicking twice here. So let's begin this conversation by asking ourselves, how many of these different words resonate with you as an individual? Couple of things to keep in mind, couple of points that I make by tossing this up here. Nobody is one thing. In our minds, we hold a whole bunch of different values, different concepts, beliefs, many of them often contradictory to each other. Humans are rationalizing beings. We are only rational when we are trying to explain whatever it is that we just did. We are rationalizing beings, not rational ones. And the next question is, which is really, really important around the whole theism-atheism debate, is how important are these identifiers to you as a person? You know, how much does it matter to you? How much, well, there's a whole, well, wait, I won't go into that. Never mind. That's a whole nother conversation, you know? So for a lot of people, what you end up, there's a lot of research that's gone on over the years about identity, personality, and all that type of stuff. And over again, this is just a recent study, religion is important to individual identity, especially when it relates to social groups. It also points out, another key point to keep in mind is that when you reject theism, you are becoming part of the out group right now. And there's a whole body of research about the consequences of being a part of an out group that's in there, and how individually you respond to it, you react to it, the things that you do. How important is this stuff in philosophy? And this is really the point of my talk today. Actually, it's really not that important at all in terms of philosophy. Most of these things are personal things, they are cultural things, they are not key philosophical concepts. The ones that actually are key philosophical concepts that actually changed the world, what was going on.
Sorry to interrupt your flow, but I thought it might be important. When you said consequences of being the out group, do you mean like being passed over for promotions or getting a job, or do you mean self-esteem?
There's a whole self-esteem, physical things, where you live. I mean, there are tons and tons and tons of it that happen. The psychological research, though, tends to be more about self-esteem and how you react and stuff like that.
My apologies,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem. Now, you notice on this list of key concepts that are in there, atheism isn't one of them. Atheism is not on this list. What is on this list is humanism and deism and secularism. The reason for this, and actually if you paid attention to what Phil Johnson was talking about when he was saying, is that what we now consider to be atheism is not what atheism was 500 years ago. What it is today is a postmodern artifact. And what I mean by that is that all the things in Western civilization and culture that came up to the 19th century, that is modernism. And atheism came out of that whole set of beliefs. As Phil pointed out, atheism today is based on a scientific belief system. It's based on the notion that, you know, as he described it, the null hypothesis and all that type of stuff. Without science, you could not have what we call atheism today. So by definition, based, you cannot, what we now call atheism today could not have created atheism. So what did create atheism? Okay. I meant to ask that question a moment later. All right, so atheism is a starting point, and I think one of the things that is really important to remember is that in and of itself, it is just a rejection of the notion of deism, of a deist, of a deity of some sort. In some cases, it's a rejection of religion as well, but the key thing is that there are no shared values between atheists. It means a whole bunch of different things to a whole bunch of different people. Now, we're going to get into this. We're going to get into why this is important and all that type of stuff. So now I'm starting to answer the question I asked before. The thing to keep in mind, and we're going to go through this a little bit more step by step on this, is that there's this whole train of thought that goes all the way back to the Greeks that ended up in atheism. But what is important and was there from the very beginning is deism. Deism contributed considerably to the building of the modern world and the postmodern world. And in fact, Unitarians, there were a number of Unitarians who actually played very, very key points in how all of that happened. Just to name a few, or the key concept in all this type of stuff is that not the rejection of the existence of God, but the statement that there was no evidence that if there is a God, that God is playing a significant role in our daily lives. That is a really, really important distinction. And in fact, I mean, you can almost, well, no. I do that. I get carried off on detailed tangents about these things, and that's why this turns out to be a 3-hour presentation. It's important to realize that it was deists and Christians who built the modern world. You know, the people, I mean, most of them were being called atheists by the definition of what the Catholic Church was defining as atheists at that point, which was pretty much, I think a heretic was considered anybody that disagreed slightly with church politics, and atheists were the ones who were like getting totally thrown out the door and onto the burning pile of lumber. But it's important to realize that it was deists and Christians that made all of what we're doing and where we're at. And it was also deist Christians and free thinkers who broke away from the church, who broke the stranglehold of the church that they had on thought at the time. All right, so we're getting into the way back machine now, going to ancient Greece. And it's important to realize that going all the way back there, what we now consider to be humanism, the ancient Greeks were humanists. All of the key concepts were there. And in fact, you can make the argument that Socrates was the very first humanist martyr. He drank hemlock. The hemlock was because he was accused, and he was accused basically of rejecting the state-sponsored religion. And he was also accused of a few other things, but that was the key point that was in there. Yeah, the phrase that's often used was a lack of respect for the gods of the state. Epicurus, another key important person in all of this type of stuff, Epicurus took the position that the gods of the day did not participate in daily life. So that is the beginning of deism right there in Western thought. And there are a whole bunch of different natural philosophers that were using empiricism. This is another phrase, actually, that I probably should have defined at the beginning. There's a key difference between empiricism and science. In our modern minds, we tend to lump them all together, but empiricism is the starting point for science. So to be a scientist, you have rationalism, empiricism, and what is called the scientific method, which is a means of using all of those things in order to verify what it is that you believe inside of there. But before you got to science, empiricism was sitting there and saying over and over again that what you do has to be based on the human experience and how humans experience things. And the philosophers of Greece were deeply embedded and involved in all of that type of stuff. And because of that key focus on the human experience, it was in ancient Greece that the whole area of ethics in Western civilization was started, where we started looking at codes of behavior not handed down from a mountain or from a lightning bolt coming down or whatever, but from human experience. It's on there. So that's going on in Greece, right? And then all of a sudden, zoom forward about 700-800 years, a couple of people's lives, a few things that happened that are in there. Whoops, went too far. And what happened? The Roman Empire became a Christian state. When it became a Christian state, a number of things happened. Just like every other religious group before them, some degrees more so, some degrees less so, they basically said, okay, we're right, you're wrong, we're going to put you to death. And at that point, the Christian state, using the Roman Empire, basically suppressed every one of the Greek philosophers except for Plato, literally to the point of burning their works. One of the reasons most of us don't know much about Epicurus is because his stuff got totally wiped off of the face of the earth, with a couple of very rare exceptions that are out there. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, and on and on and on. The reason that we know what happened in all of this stuff is because Aristotle was a teacher to, oh shoot, I forgot, a Persian emperor. I forgot which Persian emperor it was. So he was hired to go over to the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Iraq, that kind of area over there, Mesopotamia, and teach I think it was one of the sons of Darius. So what happens is that his works, his beliefs, and all that type of stuff survived over there outside of the Roman Empire. So what happened is that when the Crusades happened and the Pope sent all of these people over into there, we rediscovered Aristotle. And with Aristotle, we rediscovered empiricism and mathematics and a form of reasoning that had been lost in the 500 to 600 years that we now refer to as the Dark Ages. It was the Dark Ages for a very, very specific reason. Thought, thinking, scholarship, all of that stuff was controlled in such a way so that there was only one accepted way of thinking and viewing the world. It's on there. So out of that moment of all that stuff coming back in here, that led to more trade going on in the world, that led to people thinking differently. That created what we now think of as the Renaissance. The Renaissance started picking up speed and energy. People started doing all sorts of different things and thinking about things differently. That led to what is essentially the same point in Greek history now re-happening in Western history. We refer to as the Age of Enlightenment, sometimes known as the Age of Reason. That is the moment when, well, not totally, but it's at that point when deism reemerges in Western philosophical thought. There were people who had said it in the 200-300 years before this, who were basically burned at the stake for breaking away from the Catholic Church on this, but that was the moment that that happened. The other thing that happened was that in terms of epistemology, human experience started mattering again. Now, the thing to remember is that part of what they did, what the Catholic Church, St. Augustine in particular did, was he focused on Plato, and not all of Plato, one specific part of Plato. And that is the part of Plato which basically supports this notion of two separate worlds. The world that we live in and this other world of ideals. Well, if you're going to talk about a world of here and a world of heaven, it's a perfect epistemology, it's a perfect worldview that's on there. And of course, if you want to have a faith-driven worldview, it's important that you make people think about and think that they're experiencing something that doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in your daily life. And what happened during the Age of Enlightenment is that that people started turning away from the Neoplatonist view of the world, of those two separate worlds, and focusing just on this world. So the natural philosophers of that time, again, a long list of Christians and deists, and a few Unitarians, which I guess kind of fits both of those lists, right? Are the ones that basically sat down and started working on these things. Another thing that happened, and this is not as much of, this is more of a cultural break than a philosophical break, was people becoming upset and starting to resist the power of the church. So Martin Luther standing up and tacking his 95 Theses on the door there was basically saying, hey, you know what? I am fed up with the politics, the corruption, yada, 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 what's going on. We need to get back to, in his case, Christian basics, but his Christian basics were much more about the Christianity before Augustine brought Plato into the whole picture. It was much more of about the relationship, a direct relationship between yourself and whatever your God is. And an interesting thing is if you really drill down into that, you realize that because it's based on your experience of God, it is much more empirical than something that is based on faith. So I've argued for 40 years now that the whole notion of the Holy Spirit was actually one of the very empowering things that came out of Christianity that actually made a lot of what happened in the modern world possible. Because what it is it's validating the individual personal experience. Right? It's saying that you as an individual have a right to sit there and say, hey, I'm right. You don't have to sit there and turn to authority in order to figure that out. Okay, so now most of us think that we're in the modern age, right? We're actually, according to philosophy and the social sciences, in what's referred to as the postmodern age. And the reason for this is that the modern age is when all of these thoughts started actually impacting on civilization. So the modern age really kind of ends, I would say probably around World War I. That's probably a good point, a good time to actually sit there and define as a break between the modern era and the postmodern era. So in the modern era, what happened that impacts us today that is a result of all these different things? Free thinkers rejected authority and tradition over, in exchange for reason and experience. Secularism happened. I mean, there's a whole, that in and of itself is a whole thing, but just the whole notion that the notion that religion should not be driving the power of government it's an incredible break from the past, a really incredible break from the past. The rationalists, the rational empiricists, I should say, went in, so you're talking about people like John Stuart Mills, John Locke, and on and on and on. They basically decoupled the whole notion that inheritance is how wealth should be managed. Before the modern era, basically, if you had money, you could give it to your kids. You had power, you gave it to your kids, and it just kind of kept going on and on and on like that. The modern era broke that cycle. We happen to be returning back to that cycle right now, but that's a different talk. And probably really key in what we're talking about here and in terms of what most people think about in terms of atheism, ethics came to the point where it was really being driven by human experience. So if you stop and you contemplate Nietzsche's statement that God is dead, the importance of that is that at that point, a whole bunch of people have been working on public policy ethics, political ethics, personal ethics, based on human experience and not based on a book, on the words of a book that are going on there. So in my mind, Nietzsche made a mistake by saying God is dead. He should have said God is irrelevant. Because the key point, again, in all this stuff is not whether or not God exists. It's about whether or not God gives a hoot about human morality. If God doesn't exist, then it's the same consequences. If God doesn't care about what's going on the earth, again, same consequences. We have to build our our own ethics, our own codes of behavior, our own meaning of life out of these things. It's the irrelevance part that matters, not whether or not it exists. So essentially, deism changed the world. And in the process of deism changing the world, deism made atheism possible. So you with me so far? Okay, so that's all very reasonable, rational arguments, logical arguments that are in there. But you know what? It still matters to a lot of people. Viscerally, it matters to a lot of people. I sit back and I watch this ongoing debate between theists and atheists, and the energy that people put into it is absolutely incredible. You know, so why is that? Why is something that in the terms of human history and in the terms of philosophy and the way we think, how we got to where we are today, if it's not that important, why is it so important to people as individuals? Well, as I said earlier, we are rationalizing beings, not rational beings. We are at base emotional beings. We react to things emotionally and then try to put it into the context of what's going on in the world. There's a ton of research on this that pretty much started from Leon Festinger's work that led to something called cognitive dissonance. That book was published in the 1950s, and basically what it was, he sent a bunch of his graduate students off to take a look at a UFO cult. And basically he was looking to see, you know, why they were doing what they were doing and all that type of stuff. But also, one of the things that happened is that while they were there looking at it, the prophecy that this UFO was going to come down and take all the true believers didn't happen. So they were able to observe a group of people who believed that something was going to happen, and then it didn't happen. So what did they do? Well, when your view of reality doesn't fit reality, you pretty much have three choices. You change your view of reality, you change reality, or because we are social beings, you convince other people that you are right. And that's what's going on. In my opinion, that's what's going on in this debate. We have a whole bunch of people who, for a whole bunch of different reasons, are not totally secure in their place in the world, who are basically trying to find security in a belief system that is based on social support as opposed to anything else. It's not to say that it's not important, it's not to say that it's not key or any of that type of stuff, but it is. One last point that's on here. Oops, gotta click. A lot of atheism is a criticism of religion, and that is a very, very valid point. Karl Marx put it really well when he pointed out how religion is used as a tool to maintain the power structure that's there. Very, very real, very important. So with that, you know, I'm just going to leave you with this final thought. I see it in this picture. I see it totally in this image. It's about how we treat each other with respect. It's about basing what we do on human experience, you know, and those are all the key core values of humanism. So, am I an atheist? Yeah, I stopped believing in a deity a long time ago, but that's not what's important to me. What's important to me is humanism.